Jake had been driving trucks for over 2 decades, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with the familiarity of an old friend. The cab of his Peterbilt was his home, the endless ribbon of asphalt his constant companion. But nothing in his years on the road could have prepared him for that fateful night on Route 66. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a tapestry of stars that seemed to mock the desolate stretch of highway below. Jake's eyes strained against the darkness, desperate for any sign of life in this godforsaken wasteland. The radio crackled with static, the stations fading in and out like ghostly whispers. "Damn reception," Jake muttered, reaching to adjust the dial. His fingers froze as a haunting melody drifted through the speakers, a mournful tune that sent shivers down his spine. He could have sworn he'd turned the radio off hours ago. As the clock on his dashboard struck midnight, its red digits glowing ominously in the darkness, Jake's headlights illuminated a figure on the roadside. A young woman in a tattered white dress, her thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Despite every instinct screaming at him to keep driving, Jake found himself pulling over, the truck's air brakes hissing like a warning. The woman's face was hidden by long, dark hair as she climbed into the passenger seat. The scent of decay and damp earth filled the cab, making Jake's stomach churn. "Where you headed, miss?" Jake asked, trying to mask his unease. "Just up ahead," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's rumble. "I've been waiting so long for someone to stop." As they drove in silence, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The cab's temperature plummeted, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. He glanced at his passenger, only to find her staring at him with hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb what little light there was. "You shouldn't have stopped," she hissed, her face contorting into a horrific grin that stretched inhumanly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Jake slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't slow. The speedometer climbed higher as an otherworldly force took control. Trees whipped by in a blur as they hurtled down the highway at impossible speeds. The woman's laughter filled the cab, a sound that chilled Jake to his very core. It was the sound of wind howling through a graveyard, of bones rattling in forgotten tombs. Her form began to shift and twist, limbs elongating and skin turning a sickly gray. Jake tried to open the door, to throw himself from the speeding vehicle, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if he'd been turned to stone, a helpless witness to the nightmare unfolding beside him. "So many lonely truckers," the creature cackled, its voice now a chorus of agonized souls. "So easy to lure. Your fear is delicious, Jake. Oh yes, I know your name. I know the names of all who travel this road. Your soul will join the others, fueling my journey for eternity." Jake watched in horror as spectral faces appeared in the windshield. Dozens of tormented souls, their mouths agape in silent screams. He recognized some of them, fellow truckers who had gone missing over the years. Their eyes pleaded with him, begging for a release that would never come. "What are you?" Jake managed a croak, his voice barely a whisper. The creature turned its gaze upon him, and in those fathomless black eyes, Jake saw the answer. He saw ancient forests long turned to dust, civilizations risen and fallen, and a hunger that had existed since the dawn of time. This wasn't just a ghost or a demon. It was something far older, far more terrifying. "I am the road," it hissed, its breath reeking of exhaust and despair. "I am the journey that never ends, the destination you'll never reach. I am the price paid for human progress, for every mile of wilderness paved over in the name of connection. And you, Jake, are my latest tribute." The truck barreled towards a sharp curve, but instead of crashing, it phased through the guardrail like smoke. Jake felt a sensation of falling as the world around him faded to black. In that moment of transition, he saw flashes of other realities. Endless highways stretching across blasted wastelands, trucks driven by skeletons with glowing eyes, gas stations manned by things that wore human skin like ill-fitting suits. "Welcome to the eternal convoy," the creature laughed as they plummeted into the void. "Your route has been updated." Days later, Jake's truck was found at the bottom of a ravine, its cab empty. No body was ever recovered, but search teams reported a pervasive sense of dread that lingered over the area. Some claimed to hear the phantom sound of a truck's horn echoing through the hills, while others swore they saw a figure in a white dress standing by the roadside, thumb outstretched. The official report cited driver fatigue and treacherous road conditions, but those who knew Jake refused to accept such a mundane explanation. They knew he was too experienced, too cautious to make such a mistake. In the years that followed, stories began to circulate among the trucking community. Tales of a phantom rig that appeared on moonless nights, driven by a hollow-eyed man who warned them to never pick up hitchhikers on that stretch of Route 66. Some dismissed it as urban legend, a cautionary tale born from the loneliness of long-haul driving. But for those who had driven that desolate stretch of highway, who had felt the oppressive weight of something ancient and hungry watching from the shadows, the legend was all too real. They drove with their doors locked and their eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, praying that the only spirits they encountered were the ones sold in truck-stop liquor stores. And on quiet nights, when the moon is hidden and the stars seem to pulse with an eerie light, those who listen closely can hear the anguished cries of lost souls carried on the wind. They're out there, trapped in an eternal ride with the phantom hitchhiker, their journey never-ending, their destination forever out of reach. For Jake, and for all those who came before him, the long haul has become truly endless. Their souls fuel a hunger that can never be satisfied, their fear and regret echoing across a highway that stretches beyond the boundaries of our world. And somewhere out there, on a lonely stretch of Route 66, a young woman in a tattered white dress waits by the roadside, thumb extended, ready to welcome the next driver to join the phantom convoy. Mike had always prided himself on being a rational man. 15 years on the road had taught him to trust his instincts and dismiss the superstitious nonsense that some of his fellow truckers clung to. He'd heard all the stories. Phantom trucks, cursed stretches of highway, CB radios that picked up messages from the dead. Mike would just shake his head and laugh, secure in his belief that the real horrors of the road were far more mundane. Fatigue, bad weather, and reckless drivers. But as he drove through the fog-shrouded mountains of West Virginia on a moonless night, Mike found his skepticism put to the ultimate test. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, his headlights barely penetrating the thick mist that swirled around his truck. The GPS had gone haywire hours ago, leaving Mike to rely on his memory of the winding mountain roads. It started with static on a CB radio. Not unusual in these parts, where the terrain played havoc with signals. But as Mike fiddled with the dial, hoping to catch a weather report or some chatter from fellow truckers, a voice crackled through, unlike anything he'd ever heard. "Help, please, trapped." The words were punctuated by bursts of static and what sounded like muffled screams. The voice was distorted, as if coming from very far away or filtered through water. Mike's trucker instincts kicked in, overriding his initial unease. "This is Big Mike. What's your 20? Good buddy. You got a situation." The response chilled him to the bone. "Mile marker, 66. Hurry, they're coming." The voice faded, replaced by an ear-piercing shriek that made Mike swerve dangerously close to the guardrail. His heart pounding, he peered through the fog, searching for mile marker 66. "Who's coming?" Mike asked, but only static answered him. He debated calling for help, but who would he call? And what would he say? That he'd heard a spooky voice on the CB? They'd laugh him off the road. As he approached what he thought must be mile marker 66, the actual signs were impossible to see in this fog. Mike's blood ran cold. There, on the shoulder, sat an ancient Peterbilt, its paint peeling and windows dark. It looked like it had been there for years, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Despite every instinct screaming at him to keep driving, Mike pulled over. He was a trucker, after all, and truckers looked out for their own. If someone was in trouble, he couldn't just leave them. The beam of his flashlight cut through the mist as Mike approached the derelict truck. The cab was empty. But as he drew near, the old CB radio crackled to life. "You shouldn't have come," the same voice whispered, now tinged with malice. "But we're so glad you did." Mike stumbled back, watching in horror as dark shapes began to ooze from the truck seams. They coalesced into grotesque, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and faces twisted in eternal agony. Their eyes glowed with an unholy light, fixed on Mike with predatory hunger. He ran for his rig, the entities in slow pursuit. Their movements were jerky, as if they weren't quite used to having physical form. As he slammed the door and turned the key, Mike realized with dawning terror that his engine was dead. The CB radio in his own truck burst to life, a cacophony of screams and pleas for help pouring from the speaker. Mike recognized some of the voices. Truckers who had gone missing over the years, their disappearances now taking on a sinister new meaning. "Welcome to the convoy, driver." A chorus of voices hissed through the static. "We've been waiting for you." The shadows surrounded his truck, their cold tendrils seeping through the cracks. Mike felt an overwhelming urge to sleep, to give into the darkness that promised an end to his terror. But he fought it, clinging to consciousness with every ounce of his willpower. "What do you want?" he shouted, hoping his voice didn't betray the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. The radio crackled again, and this time a single voice responded, deep, resonant, and filled with ancient malevolence. "We want what all things want, Michael: to live, to grow, to spread. For too long, we've been trapped in the spaces between, in the static and silence of forgotten frequencies. But now, thanks to you and others like you, we're finding our way back." Mike's mind raced, piecing together the horrifying truth. Every lonely trucker who'd answered a call for help, every good Samaritan who'd stopped to aid a stranded vehicle, they'd all been lured in, their life force used to strengthen whatever entities were now surrounding his truck. "You can't have me," Mike growled, reaching for the radio. If he could just call for help, maybe. But as his fingers touched the dial, he felt a jolt of electricity. The world around him seemed to shift, reality bending like a bad TV signal. For a moment, Mike saw beyond the veil, an endless highway stretching across dimensions, traveled by trucks piloted by things that were once human. He saw gas stations manned by creatures of shadow and static, their forms flickering like bad reception. And he saw himself, or what he might become, a hollow-eyed thing bound to the wheel, eternally driving through realms no human was meant to see, luring in fresh souls to feed the hunger of the entities that ruled this nightmare dimension. "Your journey has only just begun," the voices whispered as Mike's consciousness faded. "The road goes on forever and the party never ends." Weeks later, another trucker would find Mike's abandoned rig at mile marker 66. The CB radio would crackle to life, a familiar voice pleading for help. And the cycle would begin anew, another soul added to the cursed convoy that roams the haunted highways. But the story doesn't end there. Word began to spread among the trucking community. Whispered warnings about answering distress calls on certain frequencies, about the dangers of stopping to help on foggy nights. Some dismissed it as urban legend, but others took it to heart, driving with their CB radios turned off, their doors locked, and their eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. For those who knew the truth or suspected it, the highways of America would never be the same. Every lonely stretch of road became a potential trap. Every burst of static on the radio a harbinger of doom. They drove on, haunted by the knowledge that something ancient and hungry had found its way into their world through the very technology meant to keep them connected and safe. And sometimes, on moonless nights when the fog rolls in thick, truckers swear they can see an old Peterbilt on the shoulder, its CB antenna swaying in a wind that doesn't exist. Those who are wise drive on, no matter how plaintive the cries for help that echo from their radios. For they know that in the world of long-haul trucking, some loads are best left undelivered, and some calls are best left unanswered. As for Mike, his fate remains unknown. But on certain nights, when the static on the CB grows thick and a familiar voice calls out for assistance, there are those who swear they can hear him. A faint whisper beneath the electronic noise, warning fellow truckers to keep driving, to resist the urge to help. It's the only rebellion left to him, a small act of defiance against the entities that claimed his soul. For in the world of the cursed convoy, the only true mercy is to be forgotten, to fade away into the static and silence of eternity. And for those still driving the haunted highways of America, the only safety lies in the speed of their rigs and the strength of their will to resist the siren call of the cursed CB radio. Lisa had been pushing herself hard, determined to make her delivery deadline despite the oppressive summer heat. The air conditioning in her truck had given out somewhere in Nevada, leaving her drenched in sweat and irritable as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a bloody red. She spotted a rest stop ahead. The thought of a cold drink and a chance to stretch her legs was too tempting to pass up. The exit ramp seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and Lisa found herself turning onto it almost without conscious thought. As she approached the rest area, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. The parking lot was empty save for a single RV, its windows dark and curtains drawn. Lisa pulled in, the gravel crunching ominously beneath her tires. As she stepped out of her rig, the silence hit her like a physical force. No crickets chirped, no wind rustled the leaves of the scraggly trees surrounding the lot. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lisa shook off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion and too many hours alone on the road. She'd been driving for nearly 16 hours straight, well past the legal limit. But with her divorce finalized last week and a mountain of bills piling up, she couldn't afford to turn down any jobs. The vending machine hummed to life as Lisa approached, its harsh fluorescent light, the only illumination in the gathering darkness. She fished a crumpled dollar bill from her pocket, smoothing it out before feeding it into the machine. Her finger hovered over the buttons as she deliberated between soda and water. That's when she noticed something odd about her reflection in the machine's glass front. Was it just a trick of the light, or did her eyes look different, hollow, somehow, with pinpricks of red where her pupils should be? Lisa blinked hard, and her reflection returned to normal. "Get it together, girl," she muttered to herself, punching the button for a cola. She waited for the familiar clunk of the can dropping. Instead, she heard a wet, slithering sound from within the machine. Before she could react, a pale, elongated arm shot out from the dispenser, its fingers wrapping around her wrist with inhuman strength. Lisa screamed and pulled back, the skin of the arm stretching like putty. More arms emerged, reaching for her, pulling her towards the machine's maw. She caught a glimpse of faces pressed against the glass, distorted, agonized visages of people trapped within. Their mouths moved soundlessly, eyes pleading for help or warning her away. She couldn't tell which. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Lisa wrenched herself free. She stumbled backwards, heart pounding in her chest, watching in horror as the arms retreated back into the machine. The faces faded from view, leaving only her own terrified reflection staring back at her. Lisa turned to run, only to find that the rest stop had transformed around her. The pavement bubbled and shifted like living tissue, veins of pulsing red light running through cracks in the asphalt. The scraggly trees had grown, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers, leaves rustling with whispering voices. And the RV, God, the RV. Its door swung open with a creak that sounded almost like a moan of pain. From its depths emerged a mass of writhing limbs and torsos fused together in a nightmarish amalgamation. Eyes blinked open across its surface, focusing on Lisa with predatory hunger. No, this isn't real," Lisa gasped, backing away. Her heel caught on a ripple in the living pavement, sending her sprawling. The fall knocked the wind out of her, leaving her dazed and gasping on the ground. As she struggled to her feet, a voice drifted to her on the hot, stagnant air. "Oh, but it is real, Lisa," it said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "As real as the loneliness that drove you to this place. As real as the desperation that keeps you on these roads, pushing yourself beyond all limits." The voice was joined by others, a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her feet. "We've been waiting for you, Lisa. Waiting for someone like you, alone, tired, vulnerable. The perfect addition to our little family." Lisa's fingers fumbled with her keys as tentacle-like appendages snaked across the parking lot towards her. She finally managed to start the engine, tires squealing as she peeled out of the lot. In her rear-view mirror, she saw the entire rest stop collapsing on itself, folding into an impossible geometry before vanishing entirely, leaving only empty desert behind. For miles, Lisa drove in a panic, her mind struggling to process what she'd seen. It had to be a hallucination, right? Some kind of waking nightmare, brought on by exhaustion and stress. But every time she closed her eyes, even just a blink, she saw those reaching arms, those pleading faces trapped in the vending machine. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, Lisa pulled into a truck stop. The familiar sights and sounds, big rigs idling, the smell of diesel and cheap coffee, helped ground her in reality. She stumbled into the diner, desperate for a sense of normalcy. "Rough night?" asked a fellow trucker seated at the counter. He was an older man, his face weathered by years on the road. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, to pour out the whole terrifying tale, but stopped short. There, on the man's wrist, was a mark, the same pattern of elongated fingers that had grabbed her at the rest stop. She backed away, realizing with dawning horror that the nightmare was far from over. As she looked around the truck stop, she saw more truckers bearing similar marks. Some smiled at her with two wide grins, while others stared with hollow, hungry eyes. "You can't run from it, Lisa," the old trucker said, his voice taking on the same otherworldly quality she'd heard at the rest stop. "The road always wins in the end. It takes us all, one way or another." Lisa ran for her rig, knowing that she could never stop, never rest. For the rest of her days, she would drive, haunted by the knowledge that an unknowable horror had infected the very highway she called home. Every rest stop became a potential trap, every fellow trucker a possible threat. She drove for days without sleep, fueled by terror and gas station caffeine pills. When exhaustion finally forced her to pull over, she'd park in busy areas, surrounded by the noise and light of human activity. But even then, in her fitful dreams, she'd find herself back at that impossible rest stop, trapped in an endless cycle of running and being caught. Weeks turned to months, and Lisa's grip on reality began to slip. She started seeing things on the road, impossible landscapes that shifted and changed as she drove through them, phantom vehicles that vanished when she looked directly at them. Sometimes, she'd blink and find herself on unfamiliar roads, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. And always, there were the whispers. They came through her radio, through the CB, even through the white noise of wind rushing past her windows. They spoke of an eternal journey, of a hunger that could never be satisfied, of a family that was always waiting to welcome her home. Lisa knew she couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, fatigue or madness would claim her, and she'd find herself pulling into another rest stop, unable to resist its siren call. And when that happened, she'd join the others, another lost soul trapped in a purgatory of endless roads and restless nights. For now, though, she drives on, her eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for an escape she knows she'll never find. And if you find yourself on a lonely stretch of highway late at night, and you see a truck barreling past with a wild-eyed woman at the wheel, give her a wide berth. For Lisa is no longer just running from the horrors she encountered. She's running from what she's becoming, from the call of the road that grows stronger with each passing mile. In truck stops across the country, her story has become a whispered legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing too hard, of driving too far. Some dismiss it as mere fiction, a ghost story born from the loneliness of life on the road. But there are others who know the truth, who bear the marks of their own encounters with the things that lurk in the spaces between destinations. And on quiet nights, when the moon is hidden and the stars seem to pulse with an eerie light, they swear they can hear the sound of tires on asphalt, of a horn blaring in defiance or warning. For somewhere out there, Lisa is still driving, still running, her journey never ending, her rest stop never reached. Tom had been on the road for what felt like an eternity. The endless stretch of highway before him seemed to mock his progress, each mile marker a bitter reminder of how far he still had to go. His eyes burned with exhaustion, his body aching for rest. But the deadline loomed. He had to keep driving. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Tom had taken this job as a long-haul trucker to see the country, to escape the suffocating routine of his old life. But somewhere along the way, the freedom of the open road had become its own kind of prison. The pressure to make deliveries on time, the long hours, the loneliness. It was all taking its toll. As he passed a sign welcoming him to Nevada, Tom realized he couldn't remember crossing the state line. In fact, he couldn't remember much of anything from the past few hours. The landscape outside his window was a blur of desert and scrubland, unchanging and alien. It was during his 15th straight hour behind the wheel that Tom first noticed something was wrong. The landmarks he passed seemed familiar. Too familiar. He could have sworn he'd seen that oddly shaped boulder before, past that same burnout gas station hours ago. Tom shook his head, trying to clear the fog of fatigue. He reached for his phone to check his GPS, but the screen showed only static. His satellite radio crackled with interference, snippets of oldies songs mixing with bursts of white noise. Even his watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 3:33 a.m. A creeping dread began to settle in the pit of his stomach. Something was very, very wrong. As he rounded a bend, Tom's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the truck's tires screeching in protest. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch as the massive vehicle bore down on it. At the last possible second, the truck ground to a halt, the hood mere inches from the mysterious figure. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he peered through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a man, or something that looked like a man. He wore a trucker's outfit that might have been fashionable decades ago, the fabric faded and worn. But it was his face that made Tom's blood run cold. Where there should have been eyes, there were only empty sockets, deep and dark as the night sky. And yet, Tom had the unshakable feeling that the figure was looking right at him. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving Tom alone on the deserted highway. Shaken, Tom decided it was time to find a place to rest. Deadline be damned. But as he drove on, he found no exits, no towns, not even another vehicle on the road. Just an endless ribbon of asphalt stretching into the darkness. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Tom lost all sense of time. His fuel gauge never dropped below half, despite driving for what should have been well beyond his tank's capacity. The sun never rose, the oppressive night seeming to stretch on forever. In his growing delirium, Tom began to see things. Shadows flitted at the edges of his vision, taking on familiar shapes: his ex-wife, his estranged children, his former co-workers. They stared at him with accusing eyes, their mouths moving in silent recrimination. Voices whispered from the CB radio, too faint to make out, but carrying an undercurrent of malice. "You're almost there," they seemed to say. "Just a little further. Keep driving." And always, just ahead, he would catch glimpses of other trucks, their tail lights a beckoning red in the distance. But no matter how fast he drove, he could never catch up. Sometimes, he thought he saw familiar logos on their trailers, companies he knew had gone out of business years ago. It was during one of these futile chases that Tom saw the sign. "Welcome to the long haul. Next exit, eternity." Realization dawned on him with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a highway. It was a trap, a cosmic loop designed to ensnare truckers who pushed themselves too hard, who sacrificed everything for one last delivery. Tom tried to stop, to turn around, but his body no longer obeyed him. His hands were fused to the wheel, his foot permanently pressed to the accelerator. He caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and recoiled in horror. His skin had grown pale and translucent, his eyes sunken and hollow. How long had he been driving? "Help!" he screamed into the CB radio. "Can anybody hear me? I'm trapped." The radio crackled to life, and a familiar voice responded, his own. "Nobody can help you now, Tom," it said. "You're on the long haul. You always have been." As his truck barreled down the never-ending highway, Tom finally understood the terrible truth. This was his purgatory, his punishment for a life spent prioritizing the job over everything else. He was doomed to drive forever, always chasing, never resting. Memories flooded back to him. All the birthdays missed, the anniversaries forgotten, the promises broken. He saw his wife's face on the day she left, taking the kids with her. He remembered the cold emptiness of his apartment, the way he'd thrown himself into work to fill the void. And he realized that he'd been on this road long before he'd ever set foot in a truck. Every choice he'd made, every relationship he'd neglected, it had all been leading him here, to this endless highway where the only cargo was the weight of his regrets. The landscape outside began to shift and warp. Tom saw impossible vistas. Cities built from chrome and glass that stretched to the stars, vast deserts of black sand under blood-red skies, forests of trees with leaves made of shimmering metal. And everywhere, always, there were trucks, an eternal convoy of the damned, each driver trapped in their own personal hell. Sometimes, Tom would catch glimpses of the other drivers. He saw a woman with eyes wild from lack of sleep, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. He saw an old man whose flesh seemed to be slowly melding with the seat of his truck, becoming one with the machine. And he saw the figure from the road, the one with the empty eye sockets, always watching, always waiting. Tom drove on, unable to stop, unable to rest. He passed the same landmarks over and over. The oddly shaped boulder, the burnout gas station, the welcome sign to Nevada. But each time, they were slightly different, as if reality itself was breaking down around him. He tried to keep track of time, to maintain some connection to the world he'd left behind. But the numbers on his digital clock flickered and changed randomly, sometimes showing impossible times like 25:61 or 13 hours 99 minutes. The radio played songs he'd never heard before, sung in languages that had never existed. And still, the voices on the CB urged him onward. "You're almost there," they whispered. "Just a little further. Keep driving." Tom began to forget who he was, where he'd come from. Had he always been here, driving this endless road? He couldn't remember a time before the wheel in his hands, the pedal under his foot, the asphalt stretching out before him. But in rare moments of clarity, he would remember. And in those moments, he would try to warn the others. He'd broadcast messages on the CB, begging other truckers to turn back, to cherish their loved ones, to understand that no delivery was worth the cost of their soul. Most ignored him, too focused on their own deadlines, their own pressures. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone would listen, and maybe, just maybe, they'd take a different road. As for Tom, he drives on, through landscapes that defy description, past truck stops that offer temptations and torments in equal measure, always chasing the horizon but never reaching it. He's part of the long haul now, another soul lost to the endless road. And somewhere out there, on a real highway in the world of the living, other truckers push themselves to the limit, unaware that with every mile, they draw closer to joining Tom on the long haul, a highway with no destination, where the only cargo is the weight of eternal regret. So if you're ever driving late at night, and you see a truck that seems to shimmer and fade in your rearview mirror, or hear a voice on the CB warning you to turn back, listen, for it might be Tom, reaching out across the veil, trying to save you from his fate. Remember his story, and remember that sometimes the real horror isn't what's waiting at your destination, it's what you leave behind along the way. Drive safe, and may you never find yourself on the long haul, where the journey never ends and home is always just one more mile down the road.